I will start this video with a hot take. Marika the Eternal is perhaps the most interesting character in Elden Ring's lore. All that happens narratively eventually resolves around her, from her early actions guided by ruthless ambitions to her later actions guided by sorrow and grief. Throughout the history of the Lands Between, throughout the history of Marika herself, I have never viewed her actions as something guided by hatred, not even a speck of it. Especially considering the biggest atrocities that she has committed throughout her tenure as a ruler. All her actions throughout her rule were done with vicious indifference. The extermination of the giants, the assassination of the glow-mined queen, the war against the Carians, all of them perpetrated with brutal efficiency and pragmatism. They were all a means to an end, to ensure and enact her sovereignty as the one true queen and goddess of the Golden Order within the Lands Between. Marika was a realist when it comes to her methods, a fanatical in her ideals, but a realist no less with her methods. She understood how this world worked, and how we could open the way for her ambitions. The same ambitions that proved to be greater than everything around her, even her children. But there was one war, one conflict, one that held the taint of hatred. One that, even though it served the purpose of acquiring her godhood, was also motivated by her contempt of those who abused and tortured the ones she cared for. As a matter of fact, many of the items related to this conflict tell of how hateful it was and how that same flame, that hatred, became the very symbol of this crusade. Today we take a look at what might be the biggest lore discovery of the DLC. Today we understand Marika's ascension to godhood, her dark path towards it, how it leads towards not only Messmer becoming a symbol of fear, but the subsequent genocide of the Hornsent and the fall of the Crucible as an aspect of divinity. This is the story of Messmer's crusade. This is the rise of Marika the Eternal. First, let me remind you that the timeline of events in the Elden Ring is nightmarish to say the least. Yet, it is important to at least try and discern a line of events consistent enough to understand this world and its characters. Hopefully, I'll be able to achieve this by the end of the video. So let's start by going home. Marika's home. As I discovered the hinterlands under Ymir's instructions, I came across two Erdtree Sentinel Knights. Initially I believed they were there to guard the ruins, the Finger Ruins. And although their presence in the Land of Shadows is strange to contemplate, it wasn't that far-fetched to believe that such loyal enforcers of Marika's regime would be present in one of her strongholds. After all, the Finger Ruins are close by to their location, and perhaps some secrets of the Golden Order are better left unchecked. But as I explored the area more thoroughly, I came across a small, empty, but peaceful village. And as I explored this little place, it suddenly dawns on me. The Sentinels were never there to guard the Finger Ruins. They were there to guard Marika's home. This was her home, before her godhood. Perhaps this is even her birthplace. Marika was a shaman in the Lands of Shadow. Not much is known about the shaman as a people. Very few of what is present to the player is concrete enough to serve as evidence of who they were, therefore most of it is still veiled in speculation and theory. Of the things we can assume of them, however, is that they were Numen. Marika herself was a Numen woman, so it's easy to see and speculate that they themselves came of the same flock as their most famed individual. Another of their aspects to be theorized is that they were versatile users and practitioners of the arts and incantations of gold. They were knowledgeable of the crucible and the golden aspect of life, befitting to magic users of the Lands of Shadow, where the power of the crucible is to this day very strong. In fact, the ruling class that once governed these lands were the Tower Folk of the Hornsent, who themselves were greatly blessed by the crucible as they proudly displayed their horns as a sign of said blessing. And through these Hornsent we learn of one certainty in regards to the reality faced by the Shamans, one far grimmer and darker. They were a subjugated people, no better than slaves. They were the playthings of the Hornsent. Those who were blessed the most by the Crucible incurred terrible fates upon the same shamans Marika once called family. In the Lands of Shadow, the grim art of the Great Jars forced the shamans inside the jars in an amalgamation of flesh and horror. It seems that the shamans were whipped and tortured into the very jars themselves while still alive. The shamans, like mentioned earlier, had a great skill in the incantations regarding gold and also in sainthood, for their flesh greatly melded with that of others. It's not stated what sainthood means in the eyes of the Hornsent, but if I were to speculate, I would say their sainthood is similar to how the Golden Order views godhood, or more specifically, the Empyrean steps towards it. Perhaps the Tower Folk, the name of the Hornsent who rule over Enir Ilim, expected the coming of some mighty being that would rise into the very pinnacle of the golden hue of life and the very heights of evolution. A god through and through. In the Lands Between, an Empyrean is a title given to those with potential for godhood, this title being given by the Two Fingers themselves. Perhaps sainthood was the Hornsent version of it. Perhaps through these jars they were attempting to alchemically force such a creature into being. However, this is very wild speculation on my part. But what isn't speculation is that the embers of resentment from the oppressed would eventually turn into an all-consuming flame. A flame that would soon engulf the whole of the Lands of Shadow, to burn those who abused of their power. It's never explained how Marika arose to such prominence, especially now considering her somewhat humble beginnings. For a long time, I myself assumed she was born into a position of power, perhaps a princess of an ancient kingdom who inherited the already existing ambitions of royalty. But the discoveries from the shaman village greatly changed my perspective on her character. Although I still fully believe Marika to be the most ambitious character in all of Elden Ring's lore, I now also believe that her ascension to have had more aspects of wanton hatred over pragmatical efficiency than I originally assumed. Marika was always a gifted individual, an Empyrean after all, but alone she could not force down a whole regime, especially one with the powers and gifts of the Crucible on their back. The Hornsent were incredibly powerful. You only need to see their incantations and the very individuals that are part of their warrior force. With that said, in the story trailer, a seduction and a betrayal is mentioned. Perhaps, just perhaps, Marika, being gifted in the arts of gold since a young age, allowed her the chance to seduce and charm the highest echelon of the Hornsent leadership with promises of power and the coming of a golden age. By utilizing of her prodigal skills and the use of excellent political maneuvering, she eventually found herself in a position of power and political influence. In that position, she bought her time. She incurred favors with powerful folk, gathered allies and followers loyal to her and her alone. She even gave birth to at least one child, and most importantly, she found the perfect patron to support her revolt: the Greater Will. The details of when Marika first made contact with the Greater Will or its messengers and how that first meeting went about is lost to time. But it can be easily speculated that Meter, the Mother of Fingers, was involved. Meter is one of the two and first of the falling stars sent to the Lands Between, or more specifically the Lands of Shadow by the Greater Will. She was a messenger to its cause, birthing multiple agents to one day spread what would become the gospel of Marika's Golden Order. But as Meter reached the mortal lands, the creature probably came to the realization that she alone could not spread the Greater Will's influence throughout the lands. She was an alien, seeking to spread a different belief than that of the ruling class. She would meet resistance, and one that she could not possibly oppose alone. The ideology and faith of the Crucible would not fall easily. It couldn't be beaten by strength of arms yet. What Meter needed was a human, willing to spread her god's influence. A symbol for these lands mortals to follow. A physical image to be revered. What she needed was a messiah. Thus enters Marika. What transpired between Meter and Marika is lost to time and speculation if they even met at all. But perhaps this is the birthplace of the first accord. The same way Melina offers to turn runes for us in exchange for mobility through the Lands Between, Marika's accord might have been something similar. she would spread the influence and the belief of this outer god, this greater will, and in exchange, the agents of its said greater will would give her the means of which to subjugate those who once persecuted her people, or anyone that stood in her way for that matter. Faith and loyalty in exchange for power and godhood. Although, keep in mind that most of what is presented in this segment is veiled in heavy speculation, but it is one scenario that allows us for the construction of a consistent timeline of events. In this theory, Meter would act as the Greater Will's headhunter for potential vessels from which the Greater Will would impart a portion of his power. In this line of events, the Elden Beast was sent to the lands after Marika's accord with the agents of the Greater Will, a direct part of the Greater Will sent as a physical form to impart his newest vessel with his might. But what isn't speculation in the history of Marika? That is the blood she spilled and the crusade she started. Her hatred expressed in war and fire, manifested in her own son no less. Messmer, the Impaler. Messmer's rise to such a prominent figure of fear is first recorded after the fall of Belurat, where this tall, red-haired and spear-wielding figure would impale and burn every warrior and champion the Tower Folk sent his way. But outside of that, nothing much is known of the circumstances of his birth, how he spent his youth, and how he fit within his mother's political schemes. For this crusade was the wish of Marika, not Messmer. He simply became the symbol of it. And as a matter of fact, Messmer himself hated the very flames that he learned to conjure. Now going back into the preludes of the war, after consolidating her power in the lands of Shadow, perhaps even the one who built or at least fortified the Shadow Keep itself, Marika and her forces started her coup. Under Messmer's influence and leadership, the forces of the Shadow Tree sieged the Tower of Belurat and assaulted the Divine Tower. The Horn-Sent were likely taken aback by Marika's betrayal, since in the remembrance of the Dancing Lion, it is stated, when the Impaler's army assailed the tower, the ritual of the lion dance was turned towards martial ends. This showcased that the attack on their tower and capital was possibly very sudden and without reprieve, as an art used for ceremonial dancing would now be forced into military applications. Messmer utilized some of the most gruesome tactics and war machines to ensure the success of his mother's ascension. War furnaces were deployed to crumble the city's walls, and fire incantations were used to burn every possible vestige of the crucible which resisted the onslaught. It is important to note of how quite convenient for Marika that she managed to birth a child capable of conjuring fire, a great weakness to the creatures of the Crucible. It makes you even wonder if such flames were not by Marika's design. It's also important to remind ourselves that the Tower Folk held not only control over the main political city in the Shadow Realms, but through this city they held control over the Divinity Gate, a necessary instrument for Marika's rise into godhood. In his vicious onslaught, Messmer showed no mercy to the city, impaling and burning anyone and anything that dared to show any sign of resistance. The battle for the Divine Tower was likely the only large-scale battle in the whole conflict. A blunt, heavy, but fast-paced assault relying on shock and awe tactics to destabilize any resistance. In this line of events, the Tower Folk were caught off guard and exterminated while still trying to understand what was happening. I say this not only due to the fact that the Dancing Lion lore indicates such a thing, but also to the fact that the warriors from the Horn-Sent were quite powerful and competent. Facing them in conventional warfare without any sort of trickery involved would have dragged the conflict for a long time, and the overwhelming sovereignty of Messmer's forces in the lands of Shadow does not seem to indicate such an event. In fact, his sovereignty is so absolute that he likely won the war in a very quick and decisive manner, where in the lands between we see a stagnant status quo where multiple demigods control a small portion of geographical territory. In the lands of Shadow, we see how it differentiates itself with the fact that every major strategical settlement of that land are controlled by Messmer's forces. Those that aren't are burned ruins. After the overwhelming victory at Belurat and Inir-Ilin, Messmer, under his mother's orders, proceeds to use his forces to purge any remaining gods sent within the tower and the Shadow Tree's vicinity, innocent or not. This could very well be the honorless aspect of the Crusade. In fact, items such as the Black Knight armor displays and states that a rotten odor stubbornly clings to it. Perhaps it arises from the tainted nature of the blood that splattered upon it. Or perhaps it is the wearer's own blackened soul, festering after endless slaughter. Messmer's forces showed incredible zeal in their willing to slaughter any horn scent that they could find. They offered no reprieve, they gathered no prisoners, and displayed no mercy. Their indifference matched Marika's hatred for these crucible beings, their bodies still serving as impaled displays in front of Castle Ensis and the Shadow Keep. After Messmer Crusade was finished, all that remained of the Crucible folk are ruined settlements and stragglers, too weak to coordinate any resistance. In fact, the forces of the Golden Order left the city of Belura to rot after Marika's ascension at the Divinity Gate. Her hatred and contempt for it and its people was such that she didn't even bother with settling with the place, with her own people. She just left the ruins of it to burn and rot away along with whoever was unlucky enough to survive the onslaught. Marika's and Messmer's victory was nothing short of absolute. With one fell swoop she avenged her people, punished the horn scent, ascended to godhood, removed the crucible as a symbol of worship, and laid the foundations for her future regime. The accord was fulfilled. The age of the crucible is over. The time of the Erdtree has come. The greater will is pleased. But before setting out to perpetrate her holy wars in the lands between, Marika left one final gift to those she could not save. One final remembrance to the place she once called home. Although you could say that the Crusade to be still ongoing, as according to one spirit located in Castle Ensis, the initial and major hostilities are well concluded at this point. But Marika gave a task to Messmer.
Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death. In the embrace of Messmer's flame.
Messmer, like I mentioned before, is said to have hated his own flames. Ironic considering how the same flames became the symbol of Marika's hatred towards the Crucible folk. And even though Messmer proved dutiful of his purposes, it is still stated in Relana's remembrance. Relana disavowed her birthright, and chose to stand at Messmer's side instead, knowing full well that not even the brilliance of the moon could grant him succor. Messmer felt abandoned after his crusade, for Marika did not wish to be seen as a hateful ruler. As such, she left Messmer behind in order to hide the atrocities committed in her name in the lands of Shadow. A successful strategy, since she is not only viewed as a benevolent sovereign in the lands between, but there is absolutely no mention of Messmer anywhere in the lands of the Erdtree. As grim as that sounds, it's still important to note that while Relana's remembrance showcased the thankless tasks forced upon Messmer, it also showcases that he would, at the very least, not be alone. Relana herself proved to be quite infatuated with the red-haired demigod, as in time she would be known as Messmer's own sword. She even wields a black sword ornated with gold and capable of invoking flames, perhaps a gift from Messmer to indicate her position in his forces. Here, and here alone, were moon and fire ever together. Another individual of notice to traverse towards the lands of Shadow was Gaius. This gifted and singularly unique Obnorg found not only a home in the Shadow Keep, but a purpose as well, for in time he became a close friend and commander of Messmer's forces. As stated in the remembrance of the Wild Boar Rider, both were as elder brothers to the Lion, and both were cursed from birth. In spite of, or perhaps because of this very reason, Gaius was both Messmer's friend and the leader of his men. I find it unlikely that both Relana and Gaius have taken part in the initial hostilities of Messmer's crusade, for their presence in the siege of Belurad would make the timeline of Elden Ring even more complicated than it already is. More likely, they both joined Messmer after he began his efforts to eradicate the Horn Scent from the lands of Shadow. Yet, it is ironic that after such a hateful campaign and being labeled as a symbol of fear to be despised, Messmer still managed to find loyal friends to stand by his side. At least him, unlike some other demigods, would never be alone. The lore in the DLC is so massive that you can completely get lost in it, and yet To think that such a small piece of lore could change so much my perspective of the characters in it, particularly Marika, says a lot about the storytelling of From Software. I mean, they only needed 2 items in order to completely change how I viewed her as a character, as a ruler, as a god. And even though Marika is barely mentioned in this DLC, I do hope that this line of events made by this video has not only helped you fill in the gaps and understand the rise of Marika the Eternal, but also that of her forgotten son, Messmer the Impaler. What do you guys think of my take on Marika and Messmer's origins? Does it make sense? Did I miss anything? Make sure to leave it down in the comments below, and also remember to like and subscribe for more Elden Ring content. This has been the Discount Russian. I hope you're having a great blast with the game. I'm still having it, there's still a lot more to discover, and I'll see you guys later on, hopefully. I'm out. Peace.